Okay, welcome back. We have everything cleaned up, as you can see, and it's time to start getting things put back together. So first step, we're going to get a new bearing in. It just goes there. We're going to press it in, but before we do that, on the annulus, before it goes in the casing, there's a bearing that goes on. There are the speedometer drive gear, there's a spacer, and then there's this shim. And the reason you've got that shim is because if the bearings are different thicknesses, the annulus could float back and forth a little bit. Now, there's a specification in there, but one thing that's not a terrible thought, but what you want to do is to take your new bearing, save some time, because otherwise you have to assemble that. You want to get a measurement for how thick it is. So you could see that is 0.590 thousandths, and this is about 1,000th thinner. And so in theory, if you had a shim that was 1,000th of an inch bigger, that would be great, but they come in increments of 5, so I'm pretty confident I could just use the same pieces. I don't have to replace it, but that's something that you want to watch out for. One other thing of note is that we are going to press the bearing into this rear housing. If you don't have a press, you can use a bearing and seal driver, not unlike this one. This usually comes in different sizes. It's a tool I recommend you have, but truthfully, use it for seals, don't use it for bearings. If you're at this point in working on your car where you've got the overdrive in as many pieces as this, you really ought to have a press by now. You can get a cheap one for under 150 bucks. They're not that expensive. It'll do enough, it'll have enough force for your needs, and it'll also prevent you from damaging parts. So I don't recommend this, but in a pinch, I guess you could use one. We're going to take this over to the press, get our bearing in, and then we're going to press, no pun intended, press forward. Start by getting the new bearing in place. And just to have a little bit more even of a push, I am going to put the bottom bit of the bearing and seal driver in place, and then let's get it pushed in here. Just before it touches down, you want to make sure it's as centered as possible. Felt it stop there, let up. Now for the other bearing, you need to remember that there are pieces that go in the middle. So, shim first. Then your spacer. Then your speedometer drive gear, gear side down. Then your bearing. I guess I could have done this here. Aren't you glad I have editing tools and I can cut this out? Okay, now the annulus has to go back inside the housing. It's normally pressed, but what we're going to do is sort of pull it through by putting the tail flange on. And as we tighten the nut, it's going to draw the annulus closer. That way we don't have to deal with a press and try and set it up all wonky there. But before we do that, we need to put in our new seal. Goes in this way. I want an appropriate sized seal driver. Here's where this comes in handy. Get out your favorite hammer. There. And key with the seal is make sure that it's level. If it's not, then it's prone to leak. Okay, now the problem that I've gone ahead and made for myself is I've got the bearings in, and I have the spacer, the shim and everything inside of here, but now I've got to line it up, otherwise the annulus isn't going to fit in. So what I can at least do, put it through kind of backwards. There, that'll center everything. Huh, it actually worked pretty well. Okay. Annulus fits through. Flange goes on. Don't forget your washer. And there is enough thread available to pull it through. I said we were going to draw it through. You'll need your socket. And there is a torque spec on that, so you can use a torque wrench. If you need to use a torque wrench, get something to go through these two holes. You could put a bolt through each one and then get a pry bar to kind of lever it. Or you can use one of these, a torque stick. You put this on the end of an impact gun and it will stop it from spinning at 100 foot-pounds. That's what I'm going to do because I happen to have one. Then you want to look for where the cotter pin goes. I've gone a little bit too far, so I'm going to reverse it just slightly. Almost. There. Now I can get a cotter pin in, lock the castellated nut in place. Before you do, make sure that everything turns, that it feels smooth. Make sure that when you look down the bore of the speedometer drive housing that you can actually see the gear in there. That's going to be important if you want to know how fast you're going. Get a cotter pin. You're good to go. Okay, we're at the speedometer drive gear right now. And at this point, as you're assembling things, it makes sense to put some oil on the pieces before you assemble them. And that'll help to make sure it's not starved for lubrication. Take note of the hole here. There's a screw that goes through right there to keep it in place. And what you kind of want to do, make sure that it's not all the way in. You want your speedometer drive gear to mesh. Make sure your hole lines up. And use something soft to drive it in. This is brass. Keep an eye out for that hole. And you also want to turn, it's a little difficult to see, but I can feel it with my thumb. You also want to turn the tail shaft, make sure that your speedometer drive gear is actually meshing. Don't forget that there is a copper washer that keeps it from leaking. Get your retaining bolt in. Okay. It's the rear housing done. It's worth noting, if you saw the videos where I was taking everything apart, you noticed a lot more tools that I just kept on the bench just with an easy reach. than I have right now. And that's because one tiny metal shaving can really ruin your day when you go to put this back together. So just make sure you keep your workstation clean, keep your hands clean, wash them frequently. You just want to make sure that you don't end up with dirt inside of your gearbox. It's just going to make for a bad day. Okay. Next, we've got the unidirectional clutch. And there's a few pieces. There's the cage, there's a spring, there's a, we'll call it the middle bit. We have the rollers, and then that's basically it. Then there's some retaining pieces and a thrust washer, but let's not worry about those for now. So the spring, the idea of what it's supposed to do is that it tries to spin the centerpiece counterclockwise as you're looking at it from the back. Anyway, it tries to spin it counterclockwise. Why does it do that? Well, you can see that it's higher on these edges than closer in, and as it spins out, that will force each one of these rollers to go farther out. That's what makes it unidirectional. It can spin one way, but if it spins the other, it kind of locks itself in place. And so it's a fairly simple idea, but it works really well. So what you need to do is get your spring in a little hole that's set there. Find the corresponding hole in the inner bit. And then you want to line up the slots. See, so that when you, if you release it, it's actually just going to fall out, but you could tell that the tension is trying to spin it counterclockwise. See? Okay. So now the next step is to try to not let that fall apart, which it has. Next step is to use a rubber band trying to do with that is it will hold in each one of these rollers as you put them in. So hold out the rubber band, get a roller in place, let go of the rubber band, keeps it from falling out. Have it, your unidirectional clutch. It's got all the pieces in it. Now let's get this in the annulus before this comes flying apart. Don't forget your thrust washer. It's in like so, and then clutch will go in, and as you press in, rubber band comes out. Voila! Fit your retaining ring and your circlip, which would sort of slot in, and you press it into place. Careful to avoid the sharp edges because that will hurt your fingers. And come on, snap in. There you have it. Back half finished.